Use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. That old American saying carried many families through the toughest times this country has ever seen. Back then, food wasn't just something to eat. It was a way to survive, to connect, and to show love with whatever little you had. In those days, our grandmothers didn't follow recipe cards. They followed instinct, tradition, and heart. Every meal came from what was on hand: a garden harvest, leftover bones, or yesterday's bread. And yet, those meals were full of flavor, care, and meaning. Today, we're taking a heartfelt journey through 25 meals that helped carry families through hard times. Meals that warmed the soul, filled empty stomachs, and created memories we still hold close. They may be forgotten by some, but not by us. These are the tastes of resilience. The smells of comfort. The dishes that turned scarcity into something beautiful. Let's remember them. 1. Chicken and dumplings. Chicken and dumplings was never just a recipe. It was a reminder that comfort could be created from almost nothing. Grandma would start by simmering a whole chicken, usually one she got on sale or from the farm. It cooked slowly on the stove with onions, maybe a carrot or two, and plenty of water to make a flavorful broth. Once the meat was falling off the bone, she'd remove it and begin the second act, the dumplings. She didn't use fancy tools, just flour, salt, baking powder, and water. Sometimes a little milk if we had any left. She rolled the dough out on the floured table, slicing it into wide, flat strips. I used to sit and watch her hands move, calm and sure, folding each dumpling into the bubbling broth. When she added the shredded chicken back in, it all came together. A pot full of warmth, enough to fill every bowl and heart in the room. I still remember the smell. It was like coming home, no matter what kind of day we'd had. Grandma didn't talk much while cooking, but when she served chicken and dumplings, you knew it was more than food. It was her way of saying, "We're okay. We have what we need." In tough times, this dish stretched ingredients, warmed cold evenings, and made everyone feel safe. That's what made it unforgettable. 2. Beef pot roast. Pot roast was one of those meals that turned ordinary days into something special. It didn't require a fancy cut of meat. In fact, the tougher the better. Grandma would brown the beef first in her big black pot, then add onions, carrots, and potatoes. Maybe a parsnip or two if she had one left over. She'd cover it with water or broth, lower the heat, and let it work its magic for hours. The smell would slowly creep through the house, growing stronger with time, pulling everyone toward the kitchen. That pot roast didn't just fill our stomachs, it set the tone for the evening. You slowed down when you ate it. You talked. You passed plates and made room for seconds. I remember the sound of her ladle clinking against the pot, and how tender the meat was, falling apart with the gentlest touch of a fork. The vegetables were soft and savory, soaked with all the flavor of the roast. When money was tight, pot roast was a smart way to stretch a small piece of meat into a big meal. The leftovers went into sandwiches or soups. Nothing was wasted. It was proof that food didn't have to be expensive to be meaningful. It just needed care and time. 3. Classic meatloaf. There was something so reliable, so comforting about Grandma's meatloaf. It didn't look fancy. It wasn't served on fine china. But it fed a family like few things could. She'd start with a pound of ground beef, sometimes less if she had to stretch it, and mix it with breadcrumbs, onions, eggs, and milk. A dash of salt and pepper, and her special touch, a spoonful of ketchup mixed into the meat and more brushed across the top. It went into a simple loaf pan and baked slowly in the oven. The smell that came from that kitchen was pure security. You knew dinner was going to be hot, filling, and shared around the same old wooden table. I remember how she sliced it thick, careful, to make it last. We always had mashed potatoes on the side, lumpy and buttery just the way I liked them. Sometimes green beans, sometimes just bread. It didn't matter. That meatloaf made the whole plate feel full. During the leanest times, she'd mix in oats or rice to make it go further. And somehow, it always tasted just as good. That's the thing about meatloaf. It's not about the ingredients. It's about the heart behind it. A dish that says, I made this for you. I made it enough. 4. Fried chicken with cream gravy. When Grandma made fried chicken, it wasn't just dinner, it was an occasion. She'd take her time seasoning the chicken, dipping it in flour, and frying it to a golden crisp in her well-used cast iron skillet. Each piece sizzled as it hit the pan, sending waves of warmth and excitement through the house. That sound, that smell, it was a promise of something special. But what made it truly unforgettable was the cream gravy. After the chicken was done, she'd pour off most of the grease, keeping the browned bits stuck to the bottom of the pan. Then she'd whisk in flour, toast it gently, and slowly stir in milk until it thickened into the silkiest, richest gravy you ever tasted. She poured it over the chicken, the mashed potatoes, even the biscuits if there were any left. I remember sitting at the table with wide eyes, watching that plate land in front of me. It felt like a holiday. It felt like love. Fried chicken wasn't something we had often. It was too costly to make regularly. But when we did, it meant we were celebrating something. And in hard times, that mattered. It reminded us that joy could still be found in the little things, in crisp skin, warm gravy, and the company of those you loved. 5. Chicken noodle soup. Homemade chicken noodle soup was Grandma's answer to everything. Sick? Soup? Cold outside? Soup? Tired? Soup. It started with a handful of bones, left over from a roast, or sometimes just wings and backs. She'd simmer them for hours with onions, carrots, and celery until the broth was deep, golden, and full of life. She didn't buy noodles. She made them: flour, egg, water, rolled thin with a wooden pin and sliced by hand. They weren't all the same size, and that's what made them perfect. They were hers. I remember standing on a chair at the counter, watching her dust the dough with flour, listening to the quiet of the kitchen broken only by the bubbling pot. When the noodles went in, they danced, and so did my heart. That soup wasn't fancy, but it healed you in ways you didn't even know you needed. It filled your belly, soothed your spirit, and brought you back to center. In tough times, chicken noodle soup was how you made a meal from almost nothing. But in Grandma's hands, it became more than a meal. It became a memory, a warm, lasting reminder of what really matters. 6. Chicken pot pie. Chicken pot pie was where Grandma's creativity truly shined. It didn't matter if there wasn't much left in the fridge. She could take leftover chicken from a few nights ago, a handful of vegetables, and whatever scraps of dough she had, and turn it into something warm, filling, and unforgettable. She'd start by making a thick, creamy filling on the stove. Butter, flour, and broth formed the base. Then she'd add carrots, peas, onions, and potatoes. Sometimes fresh, sometimes from a can, sometimes both. Every bit of chicken was used, even the small pieces too humble to serve on their own. She'd stir it slowly, humming to herself until it was bubbling and rich. The crust was always made from scratch, rolled by hand on the counter, laid over the top of the filling like a blanket. She'd press the edges with a fork and cut little vents into the top. Then into the oven it went. The smell that came out while it baked was enough to make you forget your worries, at least for a little while. I remember how we'd gather around the table, forks in hand, waiting for her to scoop out the first slice. The crust flaked just right, the filling hot and thick. It wasn't just food. It was comfort. It felt like safety, like home. Chicken pot pie wasn't about having a lot. It was about knowing how to use what you had. It was survival, yes, but it was also joy. A kind of quiet joy that reminded you life could still be good, even when it was hard. Number 7. Biscuits and gravy. Some mornings, Grandma made biscuits and gravy, and those mornings felt like a holiday. The biscuits came first, made from flour, lard or shortening, and buttermilk if she had it. She'd work the dough quickly with her hands, careful not to overmix, then cut perfect rounds using an old drinking glass. Into the oven they went, baking until golden and soft. While they baked, she made the gravy, usually from the grease left over after frying sausage or bacon earlier in the week. She'd sprinkle in flour, whisk it until just golden, Then slowly stir in milk, keeping the heat low and steady. It thickened slowly, taking on that creamy texture and peppery bite we all loved. When it all came together, she'd split the biscuits open and smother them in gravy. We'd eat in silence for a minute, just enjoying. It was warm, rich, and satisfying in a way few meals ever are. I remember watching her hands, steady and graceful, even after decades of hard work. She didn't need a recipe. She had memory, muscle, and instinct. It was like she carried generations of knowledge in her fingertips. Biscuits and gravy didn't cost much to make. That was the point. In lean times, it was how you made sure no one went hungry. It was hearty, it lasted, and it brought comfort that stretched far beyond the table. 8. Buttermilk biscuits. Buttermilk biscuits were more than a side dish in Grandma's house. They were tradition. She made them for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. There was always a bowl of flour in the pantry, a jar of lard nearby, and a bottle of buttermilk in the icebox. That was all she needed. Her hands moved fast, cutting the fat into the flour, adding the buttermilk, just until it came together. She never overworked the dough. She said that was the secret. She rolled it out gently, folded it once or twice, then cut perfect rounds and placed them close together on a baking tray. When they came out of the oven, they were golden on top, soft in the center, and ready to be torn open. We'd eat them with butter and honey or jam or gravy if it was breakfast. Sometimes we'd split one open and stuff it with a piece of leftover ham or cheese. I remember how proud she was of those biscuits. They were never store-bought. They were hers, and each one carried her love and care in every flake. Buttermilk biscuits reminded us that something so simple could bring so much comfort. In hard times, they filled the plate. They made soups heartier, breakfast richer, and every meal feel more complete. They weren't just bread, they were home. Homemade bread. Bread wasn't something you picked up from the store during the week, not when you had Grandma. She made hers from scratch, sometimes with yeast, sometimes with sourdough starter she kept going for years. It was a slow, thoughtful process. She'd wake early to start the dough, kneading it by hand on a floured table, then covering it with a towel to let it rise. The smell of rising bread filled the house, long before it even hit the oven. And when it finally baked, there's nothing quite like that smell. Warm, earthy, and full of promise. I can still see her pulling out a golden loaf, tapping the bottom to check if it sounded hollow. She'd slice it while it was still warm, steam curling up, and hand us pieces with butter melting right into the crumb. We'd eat them right there in the kitchen, standing up, smiling. Bread was more than food. It was part of life. It was what you made when you couldn't afford much else. It was what you shared with neighbors, brought to someone sick, or laid out in the center of the table beside a pot of soup. In tough times, it gave you dignity. You could make something from your own hands that fed your family and brought them together. Bread was the heartbeat of the home, and Grandma's bread never missed a beat. 10. Corn and potato chowder. Corn and potato chowder was the kind of meal that made something out of very little. Potatoes were cheap and filling. Corn, whether fresh, canned, or frozen, brought sweetness and texture. Together they made a chowder that could stretch far and still feel like a real meal. Grandma would start by sautéing onions in a bit of butter or bacon grease. Then she'd add diced potatoes and enough water or broth to cover them. After they softened, she'd stir in corn and a splash of milk or cream. The result was thick, creamy, and full of flavor. It didn't need meat, though sometimes she'd add a bit of ham or leftover chicken. Most times it was just the basics, and that was more than enough. I remember those cold evenings when money was tight and the fridge looked bare. Somehow she always made this chowder, and somehow it always tasted amazing. Corn and potato chowder reminded us that comfort wasn't expensive. It came from the hands that stirred the pot, the warmth that filled the room, and the quiet gratitude shared around the table. It was nourishment, yes, but it was also grace. 11. Sauteed cabbage. In Grandma's kitchen, cabbage was more than just a vegetable. It was a lifeline, affordable, long-lasting, and easy to grow. It was a staple in homes that knew how to stretch every dollar. But in her hands, cabbage turned into something surprisingly delicious. She'd slice it thin, real thin, with a worn kitchen knife, then heat a bit of bacon grease in her cast iron skillet. When it started to sizzle, she'd toss the cabbage in, letting it soften and caramelize around the edges. A pinch of salt, maybe some pepper, and if she was feeling fancy, a splash of vinegar or a touch of sugar. That was it. Simple but full of flavor. The smell filled the house, earthy, savory, a little sweet. We'd eat it hot, sometimes with cornbread or alongside fried potatoes. It wasn't the star of the show, but it always had a place at the table. I remember watching her stir the cabbage slowly, her eyes calm, her movements practiced. It was just cabbage, but to her it was dinner. It was enough. In hard times, sauteed cabbage was a reminder of how little you needed to make something good. It taught us not to overlook the humble things, and it proved that care and know-how could turn even the simplest ingredients into something comforting and full of pride. 12. Homemade tomato sauce. When Grandma made tomato sauce, she wasn't following a recipe, she was preserving the past. The tomatoes came from her garden or from neighbors who shared their bounty. Some were bruised, some overripe, but none were wasted. She'd blanch them to remove the skins, then chop them up and let them simmer in a big pot for hours. In went onions, garlic, salt, maybe basil or oregano if she had it. Sometimes a carrot to cut the acidity. No sugar, no jarred shortcuts, just real food and patience. The house smelled like summer even in the middle of winter. She'd stand by the stove, stirring slowly with a wooden spoon stained red from decades of use. That sauce would become the base for spaghetti, stews, casseroles, even pizza made on old baking pans. I remember licking the spoon when she wasn't looking. I remember her pouring it into jars, sealing them, and lining them up in the cellar like precious treasure. This wasn't just about flavor. It was about preparation, preservation, and pride. When money was tight, that tomato sauce was gold. It turned a box of pasta into a full meal. It fed a family, warmed the belly, and carried the memory of sunshine and soil long after the growing season was done. 13. Homemade pie crust and pies. Making pie crust from scratch was something Grandma never questioned. It was just the way it was done. Flour, salt, lard or butter, and cold water. That was it. But it took skill. She knew just how long to mix it before it turned tough, just how cold the dough had to be to roll out right. Her hands moved quickly, years of practice guiding each press and fold. She rolled the dough thin, patched any cracks with care, and always crimped the edges with her thumb and forefinger. No fancy cutters, no store-bought shells. Every crust was hers. The fillings depended on what was in season. Apples in the fall, rhubarb in the spring, sweet potatoes in the winter. Sometimes it was just vinegar and sugar in hard years, when fruit was scarce, but no matter what was inside, it always felt special. I remember helping her sprinkle sugar on top before it went in the oven. The smell of a pie baking was enough to bring people to the kitchen from anywhere in the house. That smell was love, pure and simple. In lean times, pie wasn't just dessert. It was proof that joy could still be found, that a handful of simple ingredients, mixed with care, could lift spirits and bring people together. Grandma's pies weren't perfect, but they were real, and that made them unforgettable. 14. Apple pie. Apple pie might be America's dessert, but in our family, it was sacred. Grandma didn't use store-bought crusts or canned filling. She used apples from the backyard tree, windfalls, sometimes bruised or wormy, but she'd cut around the bad and keep the good. She peeled them by hand, thin ribbons falling into the sink, her knife never stopping. The apples went into a bowl with sugar, cinnamon, a bit of flour, and a squeeze of lemon if she had one. Then she'd pile the mixture high into the crust she'd rolled herself, flaky, golden, and always just right. She'd cut small slits in the top, let it bake until the filling bubbled out the sides and the crust browned perfectly. I remember how we'd all stand around the oven, waiting. The first slice was always messy, the filling spilling out, but no one cared. That pie was the heart of the table. It came at the end of long days, after chores or church or school. It didn't matter how tough things were. Apple pie meant we still had something sweet to share. During hard times, Grandma's apple pie reminded us that things could still be good. That even when the pantry was bare, the trees still gave, the kitchen still warmed, and love still showed up in every bite. 15. Sweet potato casserole. Sweet potato casserole was warmth in a dish. Grandma made it often in the fall, but sometimes in the dead of winter too, especially when things were tight and we needed something that felt like a treat. Sweet potatoes were cheap, easy to store, and grew well in the garden. But in her hands, they became something soft, sweet, and comforting. She'd boil the potatoes until tender, mash them with butter, a little sugar, maybe cinnamon or nutmeg if it was around. Sometimes she added an egg to help it set, sometimes a splash of milk. The topping was always different, sometimes marshmallows, sometimes a crumbly mix of brown sugar and pecans. It depended on what she had. The dish baked until golden and bubbling. It came out of the oven smelling like a holiday, even on a Tuesday. I remember scooping it onto my plate and savoring the first bite. Sweet, creamy, with just a bit of crunch on top. It always made the meal feel complete. In hard times, sweet potato casserole felt like kindness. It was Grandma saying, "Here's something just for you." Not because we needed it, but because she knew sometimes we needed to feel a little spoiled, even when life wasn't easy. 16. Ham bone soup. In Grandma's kitchen, nothing was ever wasted, especially not a ham bone. After a Sunday dinner or holiday feast, she would wrap the leftover bone in wax paper and tuck it into the freezer or fridge, saving it for the right time. When food was running low and she needed to feed a hungry table, she'd pull it out. That ham bone, even picked nearly clean, still had work to do. She'd drop it into a pot of water with dried beans, pintos or navy beans, whatever was cheapest, and let it simmer slowly on the back burner all day. The bone gave everything it had, flavoring the broth, softening the beans, making everything richer than it had any right to be. She might add onions, carrots, maybe a clove of garlic, but she never needed much. The smell would fill the house, and before long, someone would ask, "Is that bean soup?" She'd nod and smile, still stirring, still listening to that gentle simmer. When it was ready, she'd serve it in big bowls, always with a piece of cornbread or a biscuit on the side. I remember how it made us feel, full, warm, and cared for. It was a poor man's meal maybe, but it never tasted that way. It tasted like home. Ham bone soup reminded us that with a little creativity and a lot of love, even the scraps could become something nourishing. It was a lesson in gratitude and in seeing the value in what others might throw away. 17. Chicken broth, homemade. Before store-bought broth and bouillon cubes, there was Grandma's homemade chicken broth. It wasn't just an ingredient, it was a ritual. Whenever she had leftover bones from a roasted chicken, she'd throw them in a pot with onion skins, carrot tops, celery leaves, everything most people would toss, and simmer it low and slow. That broth didn't just smell good, it smelled like healing, like something was about to be made right. She never rushed it. Hours would pass while it simmered. The kitchen would get warm, the windows steamy, and the whole house would feel gentler somehow. She'd skim it carefully, strain it through a towel, and pour the golden liquid into jars she saved from jelly or pickles. Sometimes she froze it. Sometimes she used it right away in soup, gravy, or to cook rice. But no matter what, it started with the same thing, using what she had, making it last. I remember her saying, "This is the good stuff. This is the base." And she was right. That broth was the beginning of everything. In tough times, making broth wasn't optional, it was essential. It meant you didn't need to buy flavor from a store. You created it from memory, from patience, from care. It taught us that real richness didn't come from the label, but from the time you put in. 18. Cornbread. Cornbread was always there, on the table beside beans under gravy. even sliced up in a glass of milk. It wasn't just bread, it was survival. Grandma made hers in a hot cast iron skillet, always preheated so that when the batter hit the pan, you'd hear that satisfying sizzle. The crust would come out perfectly browned, crisp on the outside, tender on the inside. She mixed cornmeal with flour, baking powder, salt, and buttermilk. Or regular milk soured with a spoon of vinegar if that's all she had. Sometimes she added a bit of bacon grease for richness. She didn't measure. She just knew. I'd watch her pour the golden batter into the skillet, her hands steady, her eyes watchful. When it came out of the oven, she'd let it cool just long enough, then slice it into wedges and serve it hot. We'd eat it with butter and molasses, or crumbled into bean soup, or just plain with a bit of salt. It was humble, but satisfying. Cornbread reminded us that even when meat was scarce and vegetables ran low, we could still gather, still share a hot meal. It filled the gaps, not just on the plate, but in the heart. 19. American chop suey, goulash, Johnny Marzetti. This dish had many names depending on where you grew up. American chop suey, goulash, or Johnny Marzetti, but it always meant one thing: dinner on a budget. And somehow, it always tasted like comfort. Grandma would start with ground beef, browning it in a skillet with onions and garlic. Then came canned tomatoes or tomato sauce, seasoned with just enough salt and pepper. Elbow macaroni was boiled separately, cheap, filling, and always in the pantry. She'd mix it all together in one big pot, and just like that, dinner was served. Sometimes she'd stretch it with more pasta and less meat. Sometimes she added a can of corn or a sprinkle of shredded cheese if she had it, but it was always satisfying, always enough. I remember going back for seconds, even thirds. It wasn't fancy, but it filled every inch of your belly and left you feeling like everything would be okay. In hard times, this dish taught us how to stretch $1 and make it feel like a feast. It was the taste of resilience, made one spoonful at a time. 20. Beef and vegetable soup. Grandma's beef and vegetable soup wasn't written in any cookbook. It changed depending on what she had, but it always started with bones, scraps of beef, and a deep patience. She'd brown the bones in a pot for flavor, then cover them with water and simmer all day. As the broth developed, she'd add carrots and potatoes, celery, and maybe green beans or corns if she had them. Some barley or rice made it even heartier. Nothing fancy, just honest, good food. I remember her stirring it with care, tasting and adjusting as she went. No two batches were the same, and yet every bowl tasted like home. This soup was frugal. It used leftovers and root cellar staples, but it was rich in something deeper: tradition, nourishment, and the sense that we would always have enough. In those uncertain years, beef and vegetable soup filled more than our stomachs. It filled us with security, with the belief that as long as we had each other, a little meat, and a few vegetables, we'd make it just fine. 21. Sourdough starter and homemade bread. In Grandma's kitchen, the sourdough starter was more than an ingredient. It was alive. She kept it in a mason jar on the counter, fed it daily with flour and water, and checked it like you'd check on a baby. It bubbled and breathed, quietly waiting to become something nourishing. When it was time to bake, she'd mix the starter into flour, salt, maybe a bit of sugar if there was extra. She kneaded the dough with her hands, strong, work-worn hands that had done this 1,000 times. The dough rose slowly by the wood stove, wrapped in a towel, taking its sweet time. Then she'd shape it into loaves, score the tops, and bake them until the crust was deep golden brown. The smell filled the whole house. You didn't just smell bread, you felt it. We'd eat it fresh with butter, or dipped in soup, or sliced and toasted for breakfast the next day. Nothing was wasted. Every crumb was a gift. In lean years, the starter meant independence. You didn't need yeast from the store. You didn't need packaged food. You had what you needed, right in your own hands. That sourdough starter wasn't just passed down. It was survival in a jar, and it always came through. 22. Pan-fried apples. Pan-fried apples were the dessert of working-class America. Sweet, simple and made with what you had. Grandma would slice up a few apples, usually the bruised or soft ones nobody wanted to eat raw. She'd heat a pan with butter, real or lard if money was tight, and toss the apples in with sugar and a sprinkle of cinnamon. They'd sizzle and soften, the sugar caramelizing into a sticky, golden glaze. Sometimes she'd add a splash of water or lemon juice to make it saucier, but usually she kept it simple. We'd eat them hot over biscuits, pancakes, or on their own in a bowl. I remember the way the sweet smell wrapped around us like a blanket. How we'd sneak tastes from the pan when she wasn't looking. It wasn't just a treat, it was a small joy in a time when joy didn't come easy. Those apples reminded us that even a tired fruit and a hot skillet could bring comfort, warmth, and just a little sweetness to a long day. In tough times, this dessert was a lesson. Happiness didn't have to be bought. It could be sliced, fried, and shared right there in the kitchen. 23. Cranberry sauce, homemade. Cranberry sauce wasn't just for Thanksgiving. Not in Grandma's house. If she had a bag of fresh or dried cranberries, sugar, and maybe an orange or some cinnamon, she'd make a small pot of sauce that could last a week. She'd cook the cranberries low and slow, letting them pop and soften, then mash them into a rich, tart-sweet blend that brightened any meal. It might go alongside pork chops or be spooned over leftover bread for a snack. Sometimes it was just eaten with a spoon. I remember the way it glistened in the jar, the way her kitchen smelled when it was cooking, sweet and sharp, like a holiday in the middle of winter. In harder years, this little sauce added color to gray days, a reminder that we could still make something vibrant and flavorful out of something small. It wasn't just cranberry sauce, it was balance. It cut through the heavy meals and the heavy moods. It brought contrast, and with it, a bit of hope. 24. Sweet potato bread. Sweet potato bread was one of those unexpected treasures. Grandma would boil leftover sweet potatoes, mash them smooth, and mix them into a simple batter with flour, eggs, sugar, and warm spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, maybe a dash of ginger if she had it. She'd pour it into a loaf pan and bake it until the top cracked slightly, the smell of sweet potatoes and spice filling the house. It wasn't cake. It wasn't plain bread. It was something in between, moist, dense, and satisfying. We'd slice it warm, eat it with butter or jam, or toast it for breakfast the next day. It kept well and made you feel full in a good, gentle way. I remember those loaves wrapped in wax paper, sent home with guests or saved for later. It was humble, but generous. Not showy, but unforgettable. In hard times, sweet potato bread was proof that even the most ordinary root vegetable could become something beautiful with a little care and a warm oven. It reminded us that every kitchen held possibility. 25. Soup beans and taters. If ever there was a meal that defined getting by, it was soup beans and taters. Just dried beans, pintos or white, soaked overnight and simmered all day. A ham hock or bacon grease added flavor if it was around. Otherwise, just salt and pepper and thyme. Grandma would boil potatoes, skins and all, or fry them up in a skillet until they were crispy and golden. The beans were ladled into bowls, steaming hot, and the potatoes were served right alongside, maybe with raw onion or a piece of cornbread. It was simple, it was repetitive, and it never failed to satisfy. I remember how she never apologized for serving it. She knew what it was, and what it meant. It was what you made when you had almost nothing, but still wanted your family to sit together and feel full. Soup beans and taters taught us humility and gratitude. They were poor folks' food, yes, but they were also family food. Rooted in tradition, pride, and an unshakable belief that no one should go to bed hungry.